Welcome to the Mindfully Gay podcast. I'm John, here with Nick and Jerry, and in this episode, we're exploring the journey many gay and queer individuals face when navigating their spirituality alongside experiences of religious trauma. From our backgrounds in the LDS and Catholic churches, we're opening up to share what it's been like to find peace and authenticity outside traditional beliefs. Thank you for joining us.
Well, good morning, Mindfully Gay. We're coming together and we've been brainstorming on topics and some folks have responded to an Instagram post I put out there about the sexuality piece. And Cole and I are working on a format for that. But it was exciting, some of the comments that people were making. But today...
We're not talking about sex.
We're not talking about
sorry
sex.
to disappoint you.
Exactly.
But tune in anyway.
So none of that fun's happening. What are we talking about, Jerry?
Today, we're going to talk about religion. And I asked that we have this conversation. And for those of you listening to the podcast, we're stationed in Salt Lake City, Utah. Salt Lake City is the hub of Mormonism, and I will continue to use that term. The Mormon Church, the LDS Church, and that's a very conservative religion out here, and definitely a dynamic that I see in my practice is the struggle that people have between I'm gay, I identify as gay, but I've also been socialized and raised to be committed to the LDS Mormonism religion. And that conflict is huge. And that dynamic is not unique. Religion tends to be this really challenging component of queer identity. Mm-hmm. And for whatever reason, right now, my practice, I just seem to be really inundated with people struggling with who they are religiously. And sometimes religion and culture are very synonymous, and so, for instance, I have picked up clients who are Muslim, who are Mormon, Catholic, and the dynamics feel very similar. And so I would suggest that what we see in Utah, it may have some unique qualities. And yet I think if I were living in Oklahoma or in the Southern Bible Belt, that I may be struggling with similar kind of dynamics. And so I thought it would be a good conversation for us to have. My hope for the conversation, and I think this is a challenge in a lot of queer spaces, is how do we respectfully talk and dialogue around religiosity as it relates to queerness. Mm-hmm. Because what I often see is religious trauma provokes a lot of anger. Mm-hmm. And I think that anger is very valid, and we should probably talk about that too. But it would be my hope that the conversation would be a respectful dialogue along those issues.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think you've said it before when we've talked about this, it kind of becomes exhausting because it does. It happens a lot in here, in circles in this area when it comes up about Mormonism and gays. And it's true. And I've done it before. I've done it a lot. It's the bag of look at what they did to me, and I get it. And I like the opportunity to try to stop that and to speak in a way, in a way that's respectful of it and understand, try to reconcile between our lives and that, and the need for that, the feel for that. Because I remember we had a talk once at our book club. It was like one of the first, maybe second session. We were, I think, 4 Agreements. Is that the only book we did that is?
So far.
Okay. And so it was like the second time, and we were talking about how even though there's been, we've been through it with it, there's been trauma, we've all felt it going through it, being raised Mormon and seminary and all that stuff. But it's still, even still, after all that hurt, there's still this need for it. Like there's still this need to go back to it. It almost feels like oh, but just to have it back again. Like it's a strange, like it's a conflicting thing when when you definitely have had some trauma with it, but at the same time, you kind of want, there's elements of the community or whatever that you kind of want back, that you feel there's this void. I know there was someone else in the room that agreed with me on that, and it was like we needed something to fill that void, I guess, because it's profound that it's missing. It's also not for us, it feels like, but it's a hard thing to, I'm not going to say that meeting up with gay dudes and mindfully gay and the work we do there isn't fulfilling and doesn't feel good. It is. It's very much so, but it's still like there's still this part that's like kind of missing, because at least for me specifically, because I was very much raised with the church.
To respond to that, Nick, something that I observed, because I'm from California, I was raised Catholic, and so now living in Salt Lake City, and I've been here a long time, close to 30 years, and so I really do see a difference. One difference I really see is that being Mormon or raised in as a Latter-day Saint LDS here is very different from LDS folks like in California.
Sure.
Very, very different. And one of the things that I observed with those who are in the Mormon faith in Salt Lake City is that it's not just community and church, it's identity.
Yeah.
It's identity. It's who they are through and through. This is just observation. Especially if you grew up in it, it's part of your family. Family.
Yeah.
You're just ingrained into this way of living. It's lifestyle, it's identity. And so when one, again through observation, when one was raised in this faith, who is also gay, who identifies as gay, decides to maybe come out and maybe leave the church, it's so hard because they're also fearful that they're also leaving a whole identity behind.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, I want to leave the church, but that's all I know.
Yeah.
That's
how I know myself.
That's how I know myself.
Yeah.
And so the disconnect and the full leaving of it is so hard. I think that's part of
exactly right.
why some may need pieces of it, because that's all they know.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly it. It's all they know. You're absolutely right. It's so saturated in family life. Like definitely on my mother's side, like all of her brothers and sisters, the whole family reunions, everything, there's prayer. It's there. It's all throughout everything. And it's all you know. But you've also known the whole time, maybe since you were 3, that you were gay, and it's been a problem. And then, you make the decision that's in your best interest to step away from it. Mm-hmm. But then it's just very it's very hard to find yourself.
Yeah, it's like, well, who am I now? If I don't have that, then who am I? If I was ostracized or decided to leave or excommunicated from the church, then who am I?
Yeah.
And so maybe you, Jerry, have worked with instances like that. I know I have in some of my practices where people are just trying to figure out who they are.
Yeah, here's the narratives that I hear, and it's almost alarming, because I think when you're in it, you don't recognize these particular influences, and I think it takes being out of it to go, wow, what was I doing, right? And that is, you're raised to believe that the expectation and your value and worthiness is based on compliance and obedience, not individuality, not authenticity, right? But compliance and obedience.
Sure.
And the more obedient you are, the more compliant you are, there's some kind of reward that you potentially will reap. Mm-hmm. And that if there is some suffering in that compliance, right, then the mantra is to endure to the end. Right? And so it becomes this interesting fabric and complexity of a mindset. And we forget that when people are socialized in that way of seeing their existence, to suggest that they change that is the equivalent of me saying, please speak Spanish fluently now.
Right.
Yeah.
You've heard a few words.
Yeah.
Right.
And you'll walk on your hands backwards. And and a total shift of everything that you know.
Right. And then part of the supporting mindset of that paradigm is be careful of those who don't think like you because they're apostate, which means influenced by evil, right? That they have lost their way. And so to venture out on your own is then to see and experience the world through a lens that doesn't consider your individuality or authenticity or particular nuances. And so I think that's why it becomes very challenging. Yeah. We look at people having that conflict and that struggle between being queer and religiously indoctrinated, and we think, what are they doing? Why would they do that to themselves? And yet we have to look at it as if we're asking them to switch countries of origin and to just immediately acculturate. I know for me, when I left Mormonism, here I am now walking this path of shamanism 100 years later, right? But I know that initially, every time I would experience out something outside of the Mormon paradigm, I would be like, oh, is that evil? Is that bad?
Forbidden.
Yeah.
You question it in your head.
Yeah, like there would be this moment of, what am I doing? And
shame.
Yeah, well, I think initially there's certainly that process of shame, but for me, the shame was much more profound when I was trying to be active and lusting after Dale was more impressive. Who looks so good in that white shirt. The shame was trying to be in compliance in that environment and recognizing that, to me, the mantra in my head was, as much as you think that Brother Bowie is like this great, outstanding elder and priesthood holder, blah, 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 I kept thinking, if you only knew, right?
Right.
That's where the shame and guilt.
Yeah.
Sure.
All right. And then you go into these efforts of attempting to, right? The response is to pathologize your existence. Right. And to give yourself permission becomes a really profound, courageous act.
It really is. And what strikes me, I mean, I know you both, and I know some other folks who I would say, I'm going to use air quotes here, kind of successfully kind of stepped away from the church and have found their identity and authenticity and have fully blossomed into who they really are. But that leap or that pathway from their early practices to what they now believe and see their truth, what allowed them? What did they have within them or within you guys? I can ask you guys, what did you have in order to, I'm going to put this aside, I'm leaving that behind and going this direction and finding my truth? What gave you that strength to do that? Because I still know people who it's like an all or nothing. Like if they left their church, then they leave religiosity completely. Yeah. Like it's so not part of their.
Well, and look at the challenge we've had when we were going with queer spirit, right? We were using this word spirit that's apparently too closely associated to religion. And I think the reaction was, and the byproduct of religious trauma, right?
That makes sense.
But I know for me, as a single person, it just meant I had to try and try harder, and I had to be really committed. When I got married, and I was a couple of years into the marriage, and when, I'm not very flexible on the Kinsey scale. And so even though I have a daughter, sexuality and intimacy with a woman just was not on my radar. And I think my daughter was maybe 2, but I just recognized I could not ignore. When I was single, it's like the consequences against myself didn't seem severe. But I was recognizing that my inability to be intimately present for my wife was damaging her as an individual and her self-esteem.
Oh, I see.
And I had enough knowledge to know that my daughter could potentially grow up in this vacuum of having parents who were pretending. And I didn't want my daughter to have that vacuum in her life.
That's tough.
Wow.
And so for me, coming out and making that shift was recognizing that I was no longer the only victim in this paradigm. And and frankly, at that time, any interaction with ecclesiastical leaders during that time was misogically driven.
Yeah.
It was like, this is a price your wife pays.
Yeah.
Her job is to endure to the end. And I'm just like, I couldn't believe that these men of God were so flippantly ignoring what was happening to her. In fact, when I left the church, it was interesting. Nobody ever talked to me, but they talked to her. And it's like, well, if you just lost some weight or if you did your hair differently, she became the subject of a lot of judgment to the point where she had to move out of the ward so she could get a fresh start.
Wow.
But all of that just confirmed in my mind that, and frankly, when I left the church, that was a very spiritual experience for me. There's a scripture in Ephesians that says the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, and all these positive attributes. And I went to the bishop one day and I said, enough is enough. I'm done. I'm done with the church. This is what's going on. Leave me alone. And when I walked home, I felt incredibly liberated. And there was some comforting thing that came over me that said, there's a purpose to this. And I didn't immediately understand it, and the journey was not easy. But it was that moment in time where I felt very affirmative about the choices I had made.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I think, it was different for me. I wasn't married and things like this. It was, about my mother and father, and they were married in the church, or they were married in the temple. But then divorced when I was younger. And over time, both while my mother's side is super Mormon, my dad's side has some of my uncles, or some of them are Mormon, but not all. But ultimately, my mother and my father, as I aged, as I grew up, as I went through high school and even seminary, and applied for college, ultimately, they were both kind of distant. They weren't so active in the church, and so for me, applying and going to Boston University, it was solely to get out of Utah. It was solely to escape the Zion curtain, and to go out there and experience a life and understand that I could have friends and a life and an identity and whatever without all that. And so I literally moved. I changed everything. Basically started a new lane. I did do a pretty dramatic shift and just got into the other side of the country. And then my parents were, ultimately when I finally came out, when I was basically 30, 29, 30, no, I guess it was early 30s. My parents were both very supportive of it because, and so it kind of helped knowing that they were the gatekeepers of those sides of family for me, knowing that they were supportive of me, then made it so I had I had a kind of an easier, I guess, in that I had these representatives, my mother and my father, that were showing their respective sides of family that it was okay for me to be this. And so it just happened. It didn't just happen. It was Cole that said, you're going to call your mother and tell her. And I did. And, it was great. And everything was great. And I called my dad right after that. And I told him, and it was a little weird. but it was fine also. And, from then on, they both loved him, and that's what I needed. I remember I don't know if I brought this up before, but the first time we came back, Cole and I, as a couple, to Utah, it was my mother's turn to host the family reunion. So at her small house, there were 109 people. Like, all the family was there.
At that house?
Yeah, at that house. They weren't all staying there, but I remember at one point they were all there. Wow. And the church that's down the street is where we did family pictures and everything. So, that smell, the smell of the gym, how they always fucking smell those churches. And so we're in there having family pictures. I definitely had Xanax at the time because I was just like, I remember my dear mom let Cole and I sleep in her bedroom, and she took the couch. And I remember taking Xanax, and don't ever take it. It's not for anyone. Don't take it. But it is, if it's prescribed, go responsibly. But you know what I'm getting at. But one of the side effects of this is like this little amnesia. And I remember waking up in her bedroom. And I was really stunned. I didn't know what was going on. And then that day is when we started doing family pictures. And it was really intense because he and I are there as a couple having our pictures taken, and 109 members of the family, and the church smells, and we're in there. And it just was like, it was intense. But from that, it was easier. It was not as, church, things were not as churchy. My life with my family was not as churchy, and they were all very welcoming of us and him. And so I had it kind of easy, I guess, in a sense. But it was, interesting. It was through the support of family that ultimately I think I was afraid of losing, because it was so ingrained and so very much about my identity within my family, and just everything we ever did, there was always some type of religious Mormon theme with it. And I guess it's through them being accepting of us that helped me with it. I think, it was a struggle. And like I said, I still kind of, I don't know, I miss it in some ways, but I guess the older I get, I couldn't imagine sitting down for service and singing the songs and listening to the talks or bearing testimony and these types of things. But can you imagine? Yeah, I'm only bearing mine.
I have to tell you, when one of my grandkids got blessed, and they do this in sacrament meeting before fast and testimony meeting. Bruce was raised Catholic. His identity is very Catholic driven. He went through the whole process. So this is Bruce's first experience in a Mormon chapel. For those of you who don't know, Mormonism has a lay clergy, and so often people from the audience are just giving, they've been assigned talks, but fast and testimony meeting is an opportunity for anyone to get up and say, to bear testimony to their commitment to Mormonism. Open mic at the church.
Open mic at church, yes.
And so, the first thing that happens is when they bless the baby, all the worthy males of the family get up. And there's Grandpa sitting there, apparently unworthy.
Quite.
Which is interesting. They're all holding a baby. There's no reason why nobody else couldn't be there holding the baby. But they make it a very pronounced thing. And so, literally all these male relatives of various degrees in the family are around my grandchild, except Grandpa.
No shit.
And Bruce was like, he didn't quite understand.
Why aren't you up there?
Yeah. And then during the testimony meeting, people will get up and say, I love my husband. I love Joseph Smith. I love the Book of Mormon. And Bruce at one point leaned over and said, does anyone talk about Jesus here? Right. But Bruce. Yeah. Right. And Bruce was just left there going, I'm not sure what happened.
What's going on?
I mean,
what was that?
For like the first 5 minutes as we're driving home, it's like this stunned silence. And I'm like,
it's processing.
Do you need to process?
Exactly. What the heck happened?
And he goes, well, why didn't you get up? And I said, well, if I would have gotten up,
the church would have blown up in flames.
Don't you get it?
But what was interesting too is how many members, as good-hearted as they were, I know they were, but there was kind of this air of condolence, right? Like, oh,
you've gone wrong.
Yeah,
we're sorry for you.
We're glad you're here.
Yeah.
You're welcome here. Don't stand up though, but you're welcome to sit and sin.
We were the only guys that had non-white shirts on too.
Naturally.
Oh my gosh.
But I know we're poking fun and it's just so evil, but I'll burn.
We have to celebrate a bit, yeah.
Do you know, here's a challenge I want to put out, and I'll give this some preface, but there are a lot of queer gay individuals who know that they're gay, want to live an openly gay life. However, they still want to hold on
this one
to that religious identity.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because I see a lot of people react to those folks.
Positively?
No.
Yeah.
No. Yes, I'm going to live in Mormonism. To be openly gay in Mormonism, you would have to commit to a life of celibacy, right? Because the laws of chastity would say you only have sex if you're heterosexuals and married. It used to be you only have sex if you're legally married. When I got legally married, I called the church office building. I said, so I'm legally married to my gay husband. What does that mean? Just because I wanted to provoke some conversation.
Because you're a motherfucker.
And it was interesting because I hemmed and hawed because they had to kind of be more explicit about, well, this is about being gay. And but yeah, have you ever run across those folks who are trying to manage the duality of that existence?
Well, you have kind of shown me some. You have presented some of it to me, and it's weird how I can sit here and say that there's this void, like this part of me that's a void, and I feel like it would be not. I can't even say it would be nice to go back because again, I can't imagine sitting and doing it, but there's still something missing, sort of, faintly, not so much now anymore. But then when I see that, I think, what the fuck are you doing? Like, it worries me, and not only, you've shown me some individuals that are kind of capitalizing on that, and that part really bothers me.
Yeah.
That feels like a betrayal. That feels like people... I'm sorry, I know I'm going to do this, but people have killed themselves because of how conflicted they felt about growing up in that. And now you're here and you are together, but you want them to accept you into it. And it angers me. It's hard for me. It's weird. And part of me, I can faintly understand wanting to have that back, but at the same time, like, you boys, you're together. You have each other. Why do you need to be accepted by that? I don't know. It's hard. That one is difficult for me to get into. I know it exists because I know it's there, but I don't know. I feel worried for them. Is how I feel, I guess.
Yeah.
What have I seen? Because I think I'm on the fence with this one. Because I think there's a part of me that does understand when our gay and queer men certainly identify as such and kind of straddle that line of, being gay, but also being part of the church. I can understand a part of that. Because I think for me, how I guess I justified in my brain is that, like what I was saying earlier, if they were raised that way, that's part of identity. And so in lifestyle, so that's what they know. And so, because I know gay couples who have been married for a long time, but they really, to me, they look like a Mormon couple. Because they both grew up in those value systems, and so that's just how they run their lives and do their lives. They don't go to church, but they just have this kind of this air, right? Sure. Which kind of makes sense to me. And so I guess that's why I'm kind of on the fence with, well, can that also then translate to, well, let's say this couple did go to church. Would that be an awful thing? Well, probably not. Maybe they still value and get something out of that. Because I think if I take a step back from that, you may not, maybe this is true for you. You don't accept every little dogma and every little saying that's stated and projected onto you from the church and its faith. But maybe there's some things like, well, that I like that piece and that piece works. And, that I can accept, like
the value of family. I'm like, that's an important thing. The love of family. What I learned here when I first moved here, it's in a very industrial state, and just learning how to kind of take care of yourself and even be a little capitalistic, even as a young boy, being delivering newspapers, just knowing how to kind of take care of yourself and save your money so that when you're 20, you can get married and buy a house and have kids. Who can do that?
Yeah. No, you're absolutely. It is. It's value. You said it, it's value systems. It is. I didn't realize that's what it is, but that you do. You start to build identity, and you feel good, and you know it's good because it's working, and it's part of who you are. And you're absolutely right. That is what you just described. That is very much. It is. It's not inherently Mormon, but it's because, but it is what's taught. It is what's passed down. You're right. It is a very, it seems right, and I get it. And I guess that is the struggle of now maybe that's the void I'm thinking of then, that's there is why do I have to give away those things that I did that I knew I learned from that faith and my family practice and its identity, and it's what we kind of had in common, these things we did to me feel, they knew I was choosing the right, and it made me feel good, blah, blah. But then I have to just to get rid of it all. And I guess that's the part that's kind of hard to understand.
Well, here's how I look at it. I reckon if I look at how I experienced Mormonism, which was outside of Utah for most of my life, it was in Michigan, Arizona, Oklahoma, the mission field. I didn't come to Utah until I was 20, in my late 20s. And my family converted to the church when I was very young, but they didn't take. It wasn't until I went into the military at 18 that I became very obsessively committed to Mormonism. I had a very strong testimony. I read everything I could on Mormonism.
Were you trying to burn the gay out? Is that what you were doing?
Well, that was certainly part of it. At that time, right, your heterosexuality was measured by how committed you were. So I was working really super hard. Yeah. And so by the time I went out on my mission, I was very well indoctrinated. Yeah. And but here's the point. Mormonism does have this idea, right? You can't read the church magazine and not see people, I saw my grandfather come to me at the edge of my bed. Yeah. And we have the outpouring of the Spirit and how you might feel the Spirit. And I would say that those things are true principles, whether I'm Catholic, Pentecostal, or a shaman. Right.
And let me just say, I'm sorry to pause 1 second. I understand those principles better now because of the work that I've done with you, because of what you have exposed me to through the lens of shamanistic or Native American. The spirituality part, you're absolutely right. And it is a big part of Mormonism. You're right. That Ensign magazine, that fucking thing. Yes, I remember now with the grandpa at the bed. I remember shit like that for sure. And you're right. That is also, at the time for me, was also appealing, but I just didn't understand how to connect with it. I'm connected with it now. I'm closer to my mother now that she's passed than I've ever been. Yeah. And it's because I understand she's in the afterlife looking out for me. And I've experienced it because of what you've taught me how to speak to her, essentially. Right. And I didn't pick that up in the fucking Ensign magazine, but yeah.
Well, it's like Mormonisms in certain religions want to say, oh, well, we own that, right? That's what makes us real and true. And yet, really, it's energetics. I've been to Pentecostal experiences where there's a really strong outpouring of the Spirit. And I think, well, if people are gathered around a good thing, why wouldn't they be touched?
Yeah, right.
But my family started out at ground zero. Mormonism took me here. And when I was engaged with Mormonism, I thought I had achieved the pinnacle of that spirituality. Sure. When I left it, right, the paradigm in Mormonism is when you apostate, you lose the Spirit. And what's interesting is I felt like I gained the Spirit.
Of course you did.
And so for me, I think of Mormonism from a place of gratitude, but it was a launching
A stepping
pad
stone, right? Mm-hmm.
so that when I started engaging in these different shamanic practices and working actively with the ancestors and the spirits around me,
Mm-hmm.
that was not so unfamiliar.
Right. It's
Mm.
like, oh,
And
yeah.
so
Mm.
and when I work with clients, I'm like, I don't know that you have to leave those things.
Mm-hmm.
Religion is religion is institutionalized. It's a package. It's a framework. To me, spirituality is the invitation to engage it in a deeply intimate, personal way. However I identify, whether I'm Jewish, Muslim, Christian, earth-based, whatever that is, I tell people, to me, spirituality invites me to consider my existence and the relevance of it in the grand scheme of things.
Mm-hmm.
And it becomes my personal endeavor. And so whether that's offering tobacco to my ancestors and being in nature and realizing the synchronicity all around me, or whether I'm sitting, when Bruce and I went to Italy, we went to, what do they call that place the Catholics say? The Vatican.
Yeah, that place.
But we both
That small
had
thing, yeah.
very spiritual experiences
Yeah.
that moved us
Yeah.
to tears.
Right.
There was an ancestral history there that touched us both.
Sure, for sure.
It wasn't Catholicism that touched us. It was the dedication of the people and the beauty of what that religion ultimately represents.
Mm-hmm.
That was touching.
I had an ex that we went to the Vatican, and it was Jubilee, and we were able to go into the catacombs.
Yeah.
And I remember, like, I didn't know what I was feeling, but there was like energy. You could feel it, But interesting point that also relates to exactly what you're saying. You remember Cole and I at first, and him in particular, when we went to Grand Canyon, he didn't realize that he had permission to pray that way. He didn't know that he could.
Yeah.
I didn't either. I thought it was irreverent. I didn't know that going into a sweat lodge and trying to connect with my mother was like, I just, you did that at the bedside when you pray or whatever. And so we both have been programmed by he was Catholic, I was Mormonism. Those programs taught us that spirituality was only available in certain modes or methods. And then, you both taught us that no, it's actually quite different. And in fact, you can request or even demand help from these people because they want to help.
Yeah.
That's just not how it was taught to us. It was not how it wasn't the program we were given. But you're right. It is, it was for us too, I guess it was a launching pad, a base that was great to step away from because now I understand in a much fuller way, in a much more powerful way.
Yeah.
This might sway a little bit, but I think it's relevant, because my upbringing was Catholic, and it's interesting how I kind of entered into the Catholic world, I guess you can say, because I don't know if this happened just as, before I was born or when I was born, but my parents, they weren't raised Catholic. But as they were preparing to have their child, me, they were kind of looking and thinking about my future, especially about education and growing up in Oakland and things like that. And so they would just kind of talk to family and friends and about education in schools and that kind of thing. And what led them eventually was put John in parochial, put your child in parochial school.
Right.
And so that's what they did. They just kind of followed that lead. And that's how we all became Catholic. I was raised Catholic, I was baptized and the whole thing. And they just kind of, stood on the sidelines, but eventually that became their lifestyle. So we became a Catholic family.
Because they wanted to do it for you,
Yeah.
to make sure they protected you as you
Yeah.
were growing up.
Which is really interesting,
Yeah.
because that's not how they were raised,
Yeah.
per se, as far as a religiosity. But they felt this is going to be a good education focus for our child. And I think they did the right thing. I loved my Catholic upbringing.
Yeah.
Went to a really small Catholic grammar school, but just thinking about, whatever religion you practice or happen to practice, there's standards and beliefs and systems and rituals that fit that thing. And I just grew to learn and know all about kind of the Catholic rituals. I was an altar boy. I knew about, communion and all of that. But interestingly enough, even though I went to a Catholic grammar school, I went to a Catholic high school, I went to a Catholic college. Maybe it was because it was California. I don't know. But I don't ever feel like it was this, drilled into my soul and body that you have to live this way or else. I never got that. I never felt that. Even though we had our strict nuns and the strict Monsignor and that kind of thing. But I never felt like, and my parents weren't like that. We went to church every Sunday. It was just kind of a thing that we did. And that was it. But here's my point I wanted to get to, because I came out while I was in college. I went to a Jesuit college in California. And this was the point that allowed me to really bridge my gay identity and my Catholic identity. Because I really kind of kept them separate, and I was quiet. I was not, still in the closet. And there was still some shame around that, right? Like, well, I'm Catholic and I'm gay and I don't know about all this. But I remember there was an event at one of our dorms, and it was one of the Jesuit priests, and Jesuits tend to be more liberal in practice and in living, I think. But I remember this Jesuit priest answering someone else's question. Someone else asked, "So what does the church say about homosexuality?" And I'm just sitting back waiting for the answer. Like, yeah.
What is that?
What is the answer to that?
Inquiring mind.
They saw your grinder page.
Right? And I remember this so clearly, and it's such a pivotal moment in my life. He said, as a priest, the Catholic Church says it's a sin, and all the stuff that kind of goes along with that. He said then, as a human being and as a person, I believe that God loves everyone. And for me, this 17-year-old kid just was affirmed in that moment. Like, oh my God, God loves me. And it made everything okay.
If I can, I'm sorry. So I went to BU. BU is a Catholic school, and it's interesting. I had two girlfriends, and one was Jewish, and the other was Catholic. And I went to mass a few times there at the chapel, and it's interesting. That same thing happened. I remember seeing this, hearing this religious speak, and being a part of that. But at the same time, on a campus that had gay unions and presence, and it did that same thing. I guess it kind of made me think, okay, maybe they're a little off over there in Utah, and I'm seeing this now, and I understand that God can accept this because God made this, and it kind of did help. It was a bit of relief. I mean, I then never had girlfriends and went full gay after that, but still, it was I think it was helpful to see that liberal Catholicism. Yeah, that I think you're right. It was California, I think, right? But that's great.
Yeah,
but yeah,
and there was just something about that moment because, like I said, I was very involved in church, and I was very involved in church in college too. We had this thing called Biblical Explorers. And what we were kind of this traveling acting group who would take the gospel and kind of put this, this contemporary plays and music around it and dances and stuff. And I was part of this group.
I love it.
And it was fun.
Yeah.
And it just made church and religion accepting and good and fun. I felt affirmed. I came out, I came out at the age of 19. I was still at that college, still very accepted at the school, at this church, in this whole thing. And I'm pretty lucky in that regard, and having that experience. Because I know a lot of folks don't have that experience and didn't have that experience. But I feel pretty lucky. But another point I want to make is Catholicism, in the way that I was brought up, is this nice container. It's a nice container, learning about the Bible and God and Jesus and these rituals and things like that. And it taught me a way to practice, I guess, spirituality.
Yeah.
Even though I didn't really know what spirituality was. I just know of, the Holy Spirit, and that's kind of what I knew about spirit. But it wasn't until probably my 30s, and I was living in Salt Lake by this point, when I was introduced to Joseph Campbell. And Joseph Campbell, he has a plethora of books and intellectual knowledge and teachings. This is back in the late 40s, early 50s. But his discussions and talks about archetypes and how these archetypes show up in just about everything in our lives, like religion. For example, like Jesus and that whole story, and the story of Christ, that's an archetype. Because we can take that Jesus story and look at other religions and see the same story, so to speak. It's just kind of, that's the template of...
It's been skinned differently.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, sure.
And so that, too, for me, was very affirming. Like, that means, like, even though I may leave the church, or maybe not believe every nook and cranny of it, I still have an understanding of what this is all about, that bigger picture, like what you're experiencing, what you experienced, that I have purpose, and I belong here, and the way that I can celebrate my authenticity is because I was raised Catholic with this particular template, but it really reflects a kind of this, experience of, we're all spiritual beings, and it's hard for me to put it into words, but it broke the shell of Catholicism, and spirituality shone through. And I've told people, because I think other people have experienced this, is that, like, going to yoga, for example, going to yoga classes has helped some people, because it was such a spiritual experience for them going to yoga, that it enhanced and helped their religiosity. It made their Jewish practices stronger. It made their Mormon practices stronger. It made their Catholic practices stronger, because they were able to kind of light the fire of spirituality and understand what that was. And still you see it inflamed in a good way in their religion.
Do you know Oprah Winfrey at some point had highlighted Don Miguel Ruiz in the Four Agreements?
Oh,
yeah. And if you've ever read the Four Agreements, he uses a lot of kind of Christian-based language, and
Does, yeah.
But what's interesting is a lot of people in the audience talked about how it enhanced their connection to their own spiritual base, whatever it was, right? Because he doesn't identify to one particular paradigm of spirituality. He just speaks to it in those terms and language. But it's interesting how many people read it, and because they know he's from like this Toltec tradition, right? They discredit it because, as opposed to, well, think of all the tools that are out there to kind of enhance our individualistic connection to things of the spirit, whether that's ancestral spirit or Jesus spirit. And I just did some ceremonies last weekend, and there's a song I sing, and so I do something to this song. There's Quechua language to it, and I sing the first verse in Quechua. But then what I do is every verse I invite a form of deity in. So I might invite in Gaia, Pele, Kuan Yin, Oya, or Oshun, or Agua. I might invite Allah. right? I'll just kind of, I can think of like a lot of them. That song can go on forever.
Mm-hmm.
But what's interesting is if I slip in Jesus,
No shit.
right? So people will be like,
Record
oh,
scratch.
Pele, oh, shoot, Jesus. but I do that intentionally because if I'm reacting to my friends of faith in a way that is judgmental of them being people of faith, that must mean something about my own sense of knowing who I am.
Yeah.
That I'm somehow threatened that you might not validate me. And I don't need you to validate me. In fact, I had this conversation with a client who said, look, I'm very LDS and I looked at your website and I just don't want to say anything that's going to offend you. And my response was, I'm very confident and know who I am. And my job is to know who you are. And so I'm going to do that in the most open and accepting way. And if I have questions about that, I'll ask questions out of curiosity, not judgment.
Yeah.
I have to be willing to witness people in their space.
Mm-hmm.
I am not a MAGA supporter. But give me a MAGA supporter who wants to have an open dialogue. Because in that dialogue, I'm likely to learn something about myself.
Mm-hmm.
But isn't that the humanity that we really hunger for ourselves? If we want to be understood, we have to be in the place of being understanding.
Yes.
Oh my gosh.
That doesn't mean I have to convert or change or accept.
Agreed.
But I want to hear where you're coming from. And that has been such a powerful tool in my life, and I'm not always expert at it. I had a really powerful experience once on medicine. My daughter is a very committed and I'm just recalling the moment because I've always struggled with, like, how does she see me as an active Mormon person? And it was on an ayahuasca journey, and I was really praying about this issue. And what came to me was that I needed to really deeply respect the things that brought her joy. And I needed to demonstrate that respect. Interesting, it wasn't I kind of maybe went into that thinking, how do I reach her? How do I get her to see it my way? And I came out of it realizing that the work was mine.
That's huge, Jerry.
Mm-hmm.
That's huge. And I'm sorry, I just have to say like that, but I feel like that's what we have to do as gay people. And it's hard because we feel so victimized and so beat up, but we have to do that. When they go low, we go high. It's that thing, that pipe ceremony we just had with Equality Utah, and it's what he's trying to do, and it's what he wants to have a meeting and listen and understand. We have to initiate that. We have to do that and be in a place of understanding. And it's so hard. It's so hard right now. The political landscape is super challenging at this right now. All of my clients I work with, we're talking about, we're all on the same page politically, and we're talking about the other side, and it's a lot of these idiots and that type of stuff. But you're right. If we want to be the change we want to see in this world, we've got to be understanding. We have to do the work. And that example you just gave is very touching because as a father, of course, I understand you want her to be happy, and you need to understand it, even if that's tough, but that's what we have to do as gay people. We have to rise above this, and we have to understand their happiness and what brings them happiness. And I think it will help. Maybe it will help bridge things better.
Yeah.
I really do see it as one of going back to our episode of gay gifts and blessings.
Yep.
That's just, maybe that's, part of our power and reasonings for being here in this way. And maybe with this sprinkle of spirituality in whatever form that might show up, that, we are able to kind of be those catalysts and open ears and open arms to help bridge gaps and be that understanding, middle person. That's our power.
I'm going to give an example because it's something I'm pretty proud of. And it was not an easy process. But here in Utah, there was this huge kind of social political divide between therapists, where there was like the gay affirmative camp of therapists, and then there was like the anti-gay camp of therapists who were kind of holding on to conversion therapy and faith-based kinds of ideas. And a colleague of mine by the name of Jim Struve and Lee Beckstead kind of pulled their heads together and said, we got to somehow bridge this gap. And we had this huge gathering of probably 100 therapists who were across all these fields. And we went out and invited therapists from BYU and from the conservative camps and reparative therapists, and even representatives from LDS Family Services came. And there was this open dialogue, and it was kind of dicey and it was kind of chopped, but the idea was dialogue. And what came of that was a smaller group. There was about 8 of us originally. And you can find our website called reconciliationandgrowth.com. But for 10 years, like half of us, there was 4 of us who were on the more liberal end of the continuum, like gay affirmative. And then we had conversion therapists, BYU professors, people who were known for their kind of pro-conversion kind of stances. And we met every other week for 10 years.
Wow.
And the idea was to engage in dialogue. And eventually we came to some consensus as a group that would satisfy both camps about how to ethically sit and work with clients that were struggling with faith and religious and sexual orientation and gender identities. And I can tell you some of those meetings were very rough. And it meant that we had to sit, and we had to sit and really actively witness each other in the stories in which we were showing up. And so there were guys who said, I've changed my sexual orientation. And so we sat and we listened with deep curiosity about what that was, what was motivating them, what did that look like? And they also had to sit and I remember when my daughter got married in the Mormon temple and I had to sit in the waiting room, I brought that to the group. And they had to hear my struggle with that. And what happened is there was this one woman on this group. Whenever, when I was a gay activist in the 90s, and I would frequently get asked to go to conferences and to speak. And I'd literally have a room full of hecklers. And this one woman one time we somehow got asked to present together. And boy, we had it out in front of 200 people. We had this really intense conflict. And she came to my wedding. In fact, today's our wedding anniversary. But she came, brought a beautiful plant, showed up. In fact, 2 of them showed up. And I guess what I'm saying is, it's so convenient to put someone in the place of opposition. It's so convenient to see someone as the other. What happens when I sit back and listen with some compassionate curiosity? I don't agree with those people, and we still have points of disagreement, but we develop some sense of respect. And that led to me having an opportunity to go to the church office building in which there were these 3 different general authorities, but the group of the LDS Family Services, like a couple hundred of them, they wanted to hear my story.
That's huge. Right.
And it was scary as hell. But the reason they wanted to hear my story is they recognized that I could share my story and be honest without projecting judgments or accusations.
Right.
And I got a standing, so one of a few times I got a standing ovation.
Wow. From that crowd.
And a gift basket. But I think like what Equality Utah is trying to do with this open dialogue. Yeah. Even Governor Cox has suggested it. I don't think he's doing a very good job of being an example of it. But what would happen to our social dialogue that instead of taking sides, we began to listen to each other?
Listen.
And I'm going to tell you, in listening to people, that is a place of spirit.
Yes. Yes. Truly is. Listening. We
with compassion.
With compassion. We talk over, we talk at, we're not listening. And so whatever background, religious, gender, race, if we can just listen to individual story and sit with compassionate ears, I mean, that would just be so, that's spirituality.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I still want to be able to verify, look, a lot of gay men, a lot of gay queer folks have been traumatized by religious institutions. So here's the piece about trauma. At the core of trauma is the story that I attached to the episode. I may not have control to what happened to me, but I can frame how I see it and what influence it has in my life.
Yes.
And so what I want to say to those who are angry at family, angry at their religions, find a place and an opportunity to work on that anger, to explore the hurt associated with it, but then find the opportunity and the power within yourself to shape that sense of identity in a place that you find your strength through that trauma.
Absolutely. Yes.
And that will fortify your capacity to sit, to listen, to witness, and to represent yourself. Because now you're authentic and you know yourself.
Absolutely.
Very well said.
And on that path, on that journey, from that traumatic moment and that not having control over that, but now you're reframing of that and just seeing it in a different way. Along that path, finding your tribe, finding your community, the ones who are going to listen. That's why we continue to ask you and invite you to our community, to our social gatherings. Because maybe if you are in that situation of being angry at your church, etc., in your religion, and just don't know how to or who to talk to, maybe you'll stumble across someone or someones at one of our social events who can relate and who will listen to you without judgment. Yeah. Or take part in one of our little ceremonies, whether it's sweat or pipe ceremony, or just having ice cream with us. You may find someone who is listening intently to you and your story. And that can begin that process, begin that journey, so that you have that transformation.
Maybe at our coming out ritual, we have a sacrament. And the sacrament will be the ice cream with the sprinkles. We take this ice cream and we bring it into our body and experience joy and bliss.
In its gayest form ever.
We'll wash it down with a LaCroix shot or something. Yeah, that's funny. Yeah.
Well, you know, we had this conversation about sex and we said, we got to come back and talk more about sex. and I hope people respond to this. I would love to hear some comments or observations or questions, because this is a huge issue, and I would love for us to be able to come back and revisit it with feedback from our listeners.
Absolutely.
So that it's relevant. I think it definitely was relevant for the three of us in terms of our experiences, but I'd be very curious to know how other people experience this. So, in the name of Jesus. So, I want to thank everyone for listening. I hope this was provocative and helpful. So again, we're very willing to hear your feedback. It feels like this becomes a platform, and we know there are people listening to us because they reveal themselves all the time in interesting spaces. But we are really hungry for your voices, because we see this as a process. I think of this as a social experiment,
For sure.
and that we're kind of opening a door, by no way in a definitive way, but an invitation for you to bring your feedback. The retreat's an opportunity to do that. Our coming out ritual in October will be an opportunity to do that. Any of our events, just come and show up. But we want to thank you for listening and participating. And until next time, thank you.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of the Mindfully Gay podcast. We hope our conversation resonated with you.
Remember, your journey is uniquely yours, and there's light on the other side. Keep exploring and connecting with those who support you.
We'd love to hear your stories, so feel free to share with us on Instagram, and check out mindfullygay.com for upcoming free social events where you can meet others on similar paths.